Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Origination Point podcast. This is your host, Bill De La Cruz. And if you've been listening for a while, you know that part of the approach in this podcast is just talking about things that are relevant for all of us. How do we work through change? How do we work through the challenges that we're all facing on a global level in our country and our communities? And most importantly, I think, how do we remain hopeful in times of uncertainty like we're living in today? And I think, again, if you've been a long time listener, we just interview folks and hear their story because everybody has a story and everybody's story matters. And I think another reason why I think this is so important is we're so locked into doing what we call building relationships on social media, which I think is impossible because you don't really connect with somebody if you can't see them. And I think it's more effective, even if you were to have a Zoom call with somebody, than to just text them or do social media. And so the other part of this approach is thinking about how do we get back to reconnecting with our hearts and rehumanizing ourselves to each other and actually having a conversation where we can not only see each other, we can feel the emotionality that's going on between two people when they're in a conversation together. And so we've been sharing that message for quite some time now. And I've got another interesting guest. Her name is Bambi Lynn, and I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell you her story. And I just want to remind you that as we go through this podcast, that parts of what you hear may be parts of your own story or your own life experience, and know that that if we're willing to do the work, the changes will happen. And so I'm just really excited to get in our conversation and see where it goes. So, Bambi, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell our listeners a bit about who you are?
Absolutely. I'll start with something that I did this morning. I had a friend of mine that gave me a bunch of lemons and from her lemon tree, and just before we had a freeze in Georgia, she took her lemons down and she gave me a bag of them. So this morning I decided, oh my goodness, you know what? I'm going to make lemonade. And we all know the whole statement of, let's take the lemons and make lemonade. Let's
Yeah.
take our life and make something out of it. So, I'm cutting up the lemons, and it wasn't as easy as I thought it was to like twist and turn to get the juice out, but life is not like that. Life isn't perfect. Life isn't easy. Sometimes you got to twist and you got to turn. But as you're doing that, and all the liquids is going inside of the container, and then you have all these seeds, that are there, and it reminds you that you have to plant seeds in order to get a harvest. Somebody had to
Mm-hmm.
plant the lemon seeds in order for me to get a lemon tree, and in order for her to give me the lemon. So I think about that with life. We have to plant into people's lives in order to get harvests. And then as I'm putting it in, and you have to add some sugar to the bitterness, because I did taste the lemon and it was pretty bitter. And sometimes in life is bitter. Sometimes in life
Yeah.
is hard. But when you add a little bit of sweetness to it, and you don't just look at the bitterness of life, but you decide to add some sweetness to it, it comes out this amazing lemonade. But there was a process to it. And there's always a
Yeah.
process in our lives, to get from the lemon to the lemonade. So that's how I look at life. And here, I was given this word picture today, to be able to be on this podcast. So, yes, my name is Bambi, and I am a mother of 6 adult children. I do have 13 grandchildren. I am a blogger.
Yeah.
I have a website. I'm an author of 2 books that have been published, and 1 book that is going to be published in June or July. I have been on as a guest on over 140 podcasts, just being able to share my story. And I'm just a woman that wants to influence this generation and to take our stories and to heal from them. That we don't need to hold our stories in a box and think that we're the only ones in life that has gone through something. I want Somebody asked me on a podcast just recently, what would your superpowers be? And I said,
Mm.
vulnerability. I have chosen to be vulnerable enough to tell my story so that others can be brave enough to tell theirs. So I guess that was the introduction, that I wanted to give, just take the
Great.
lemons out of, make lemonade.
Well, and I think the piece around the personal change process or just living life, it is a process, and it's not just it's so interesting to me to get on Facebook or even on LinkedIn and to read all these ads where people say, if you do this for a week, you will lose 50 pounds and keep it off. Or if you do this for a week, you will be, all your troubles will be gone. And I'm like,
Yeah.
whoa, that's amazing. And I don't think that's really true.
No.
And so it's interesting to me how people in some ways take advantage of other people's vulnerabilities
Yes.
to say, if you do this, this will happen, versus the reality that what you've shared and what my experience has been is it's a process and it takes time. And what I tell people is, well, they say, well, how long will it take to change? I said, well, how hard are you willing to work?
Yes.
Because it can shift when you decide to do the work. So and the story piece. So let's jump in. Why don't you share a little bit of your story and talk about how you got to doing the things, and then also when you say I want to influence, what do you mean by how you want to influence the generations of folks that are
Absolutely.
listening and on our planet?
Absolutely. Well, I'll start off with, when I turned 49 years old, before I was going to be 50, my friends told me, you need to do something out of the ordinary. You need to do something to get into being 50, that you'll never, that you've never done before. So some of my friends said, you need to get a tattoo. Why don't you get a tattoo? And I'm like, just don't want a tattoo. I've never had one. Why start now? I do have all of my children, but one have tattoos. So it's not I'm against it. I just don't need a writing
Yeah.
on it, whatever. So just prior to that, I had gone to an iFly, an indoor skydiving place that they take you indoors
Okay.
and you get to skydive. And the guy says to me, this is exactly how it feels if you ever want to go real skydiving. So I'm like, oh my goodness, this isn't bad. This is pretty cool. And I had gone on a hot air balloon ride before, and that was really cool because you could hear the people down below and you can have conversations. So I decided, okay, I'll go skydiving. And I took one of my daughters with me. Just like I said, I'm 6. And my daughter went with me. And at first I'm pretty cocky. I'm pretty excited like we are in life. We're pretty cocky about how life is going to happen for us. We have all these dreams.
Hmm.
We've been playing house our whole lives and how it's all going to turn out. We leave our parents home and we say we're never going to raise our children that way. Oh, we're not going to be that kind of person. We have it pretty much all together. So they hook you up and they strap you like really tight, and you go,
Yep.
and I'm like going, oh, I'm a mother of 6. I have grandchildren. I can do this. And I have these words written across my hand that says, leave no doubt. So when I'm up in the air, I can put them out and so everybody can see it. We get into the plane, 17,000 feet into the air. I'm the first idiot that has to jump out of the plane. Didn't know that. Didn't know that I was going to be the first one. He opens up the door and he says, "Hey, get to the edge." And then of course he gets on top of you because it's a tatum. And so you
Yeah.
think about life and you think, oh my goodness, I got all this garbage on top of me. I've got all this baggage on top of me. So I get to the edge and I'm looking out. They don't count. They don't go 1, 2, 3 because they know you're going to grab the sides of the plane. They just wait till you're like calm. And then all of a sudden they shove you out of the plane and you're like dropping and you're screaming. I have gum in my mouth and it falls out of my mouth. So I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I just hit somebody like the Empire State Building and I killed them, by them dropping my gum. Then vomit goes into my face and the guy's on the back and he's like, hey, this is fun. And then I see pictures that I'm like the dog in the window with your cheeks all flapping and everything. And he tells you, are you having fun? Are you having fun? And you're like, just want him to shut up, and he tells you at the end, he says, hey, Don't land on your feet and don't land on your knees. Land on your ass. And so, you're falling and you're trying to land on your ass, and then you don't land very nicely. And then he looks at you and goes, "Wasn't that fun?" And I said, "Hell no." He said, "Would you like to do this again?" Hell no. That's the definition of life. That is such an amazing word picture about life. You only got to live it once, but you're going to be falling on your ass over and over and over again. And then you're going to be apologizing to your parents because you thought you were better than them. And you realize you're no better because life gives you different avenues, gives you different chapters. So I think about
Yeah.
that is such an amazing word picture from life. It's not the falling that even matters because we're all going to fall. We're not leaving here without any scars. We're not leaving here without any bruises that we have experienced in life. But it's the getting up that matters. Since I wrote my
Yeah.
story, The Journey of Josephine, and that story was my story of what happened to me throughout my life and the trauma that took place within my household when I was a little girl, all the way up until, I was married a couple times. One, I was a victim of domestic violence, and another one, he decided every I don't know, every 18 months, he was going to go have an affair on me. I had four
Mm.
children very young in my life. I had four children by the age of 22 years old. And I had a teenage pregnancy. I had some suicide attempts that I tried to take my life after I had an uncle um, that abused me as a 16-year-old girl. So there was so much trauma, but then there came
Yeah.
up. So I wrote my story, and it took me 25 years to write my story because I kept waiting for the moment. When was it time? And when was it time
Mm.
to be vulnerable enough to be able to share it in writing? And when I wrote my story and I got my story back, um, and I sat that one night and I sat and I read my story all the way through, and I cried, I wept, I healed a little bit more. And I closed the book and I said, "Oh my goodness, God, I'm not this woman anymore." And I said, "But now I want to find that woman. I want to be able to use my story to find that woman, that she could have the bravery and the courage to be able to be vulnerable enough to share her story." I think that sometimes we get so caught up in the secrets of our story and we think that nobody is going to understand what we have been through. So we hide them in a closet. And, the problem of hiding them in the closet, more skeletons keep coming in, and it's harder and harder to keep that closet closed. But if you
Hmm.
decide to share your story and to be amongst the brave and amongst the courageous women and men that have shared their stories, we're all locking arms with each other. We're all building a community. We're all realizing we don't live in a globe anymore, that there are so many other people that have been through what we have been through. And that's my mission. My mission is to find that woman and to tell her it's okay to be vulnerable.
That's quite a growing story, and I will even say that what's interesting too about life is that two people could go through a similar experience and have a different outcome.
Absolutely.
So,
I think
so
about
when you
that with my
were,
kids. I'm a mother of
yeah,
six. And so, even though your children lived in the same household, they got different versions of you. The more that you started to heal
hmm,
and transform, your children had a different version. So I tell mothers even now that are struggling with adult children and they're saying, my children haven't spoken to me. We just have to realize and know that we're going to have villains in our story and we're going to have heroes in our stories. There are six children in my household that were in my household, and two of them look at me as the villain in their lives. Two of them feel like I
hmm,
ruined their life. And then the other four feel like, some of them like, mom's in between, but then the other ones are like, she's my hero. So that's something that you have to accept. And that's something, but that comes with healing because then you begin to stop blaming yourself that, you're a villain in some people's lives and you're a hero in others. And you start just accepting the fact that they're on different journeys. They're on different times in their lives and they're healing through their own story.
yeah, and it's always interesting about when when people perceive me in different ways. I'm always curious about how did you experience me that led you to your perception, your feelings, whatever it is that you're experiencing me as. And so, which is a different question than what's wrong with you.
Hmm.
How are you experiencing me opens up a conversation for their perception. And part of what I was going to share was on the jumping out of a plane story. When my son was 18, I said, well, what do you want to do for your 18th birthday? And he said, well, let's go skydiving. And I was like, okay. So, and I was really excited about it. I've never done it before. And same thing, it was a tandem piece. And we got to the door and he just pushed me out. And I thought it was incredible because you're falling first at almost 200 miles an hour for what seems like an eternity, but isn't really that long. And then when he pulled the parachute, it was just like, you shoot up in the air, and then it's just like it was this overwhelmingly quiet time where you just floated all the way down, and he just landed and we were back on the ground. And it wasn't something I do again because I have this philosophy that I'll try anything once, and I did that. And so, but it always struck me about that, how we can be falling so fast and so hard, and then pull the right string, and now we're floating and it's quiet, and we can be contemplative and see this whole big
Yeah.
expanse, and then you're grounded.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean. It's like we both went skydiving, and yet we had a different experience,
Absolutely.
right?
Now,
And
I
so
went on a hot air balloon and I loved that because it's the peacefulness of it. I guess I
yeah,
couldn't experience the peacefulness of the hot air, of the airplane, because when they shoved that, took that hook,
yeah,
and you're like, everything, that thing moves, and you're like, I'm
yeah,
just thinking, oh my goodness, what have I just done? And then my
yeah,
daughter went, which was kind of funny. My daughter went, she was after me. And so that when you get to the room, they are videoing the people that are
yeah,
dropping. Well, my
yeah,
daughter is going, F my mom, F my mom. Like, oh. So these people are in this room going, I feel sorry for her mom. Who is her mom?
yeah.
It's a
So
totally different experiences, but still the
yeah,
same thing. It's still the dropping in our lives. You have to fall. You have to get up. You have to, and you're going to experience things continually. Some people love roller coasters. I hate roller coasters. If I wanted
yeah,
morning sickness continually, I'd have another baby. I'm not interested in morning sickness, and that's what it does to me. I hate roller coasters. And some people love the thrill of that in their lives. I'm just not interested.
yeah. And some of it is just recognizing that we can do similar things and have different experiences, and we can either debate or argue over whose experience is correct or right or better, or just acknowledge that we did something similar and yet had a different experience or a different outcome. And I
Absolutely.
think also an interesting approach to this dialogue, because I think especially today in our country, people are spending a lot more time debating over who's right and who's wrong, versus we just have different perceptions
Absolutely.
of how we view the world. And so what did you do to open up your vulnerability? Because I grew up in a home of more physical abuse and verbal abuse, and I know that being vulnerable and being self-aware were not really attributes that were alive in that type of environment. And I'm going to presume that that may have been similarly true for you. And I know it took me a journey to figure out, well, what does it mean to be vulnerable and to share my story, even to tap into what my story is outside of just that victimness,
Hmm.
was really challenging. So I'm curious, like, what did you have to do to acknowledge that young life that you went through, and then be vulnerable. I think part of what you said is it took me 25 years to write this book
Yeah,
because there was so much connected to it that was probably highly emotional. So
absolutely.
maybe you can talk a little bit about what you went through to get to
Yeah.
that place.
I people would, let's talk about the elephant in the room, my name. My name is a very different name to and you would think that my name would put me into situations and circumstances that would make me feel invisible. I mean, invincible. You would think that it would be like this name would come across as a strong, independent woman. But as a young girl, this name made me invisible. This name made me be bullied and picked on. And it didn't give me a seat at the table. It gave me mockery. It gave me people that wouldn't date me because of my name, but would want to take me in the backseat of their cars, but wouldn't want to tell anybody who I was and that they would introduce me as a girlfriend. My name created this bulliness in our school. I wasn't invited to proms. I didn't get invited to dances. I didn't have a boyfriend that I got to hold his hand in the hallway, because my name, had a connotation, to women. My name represented this cute little deer, on the Disney character. But to men, my name meant pole dancer, meant exotic dancer, because when men would go to dances, usually Bambi, Buffy, Bunny, or whatever would be the names of the dancers.
Mm. Okay.
So I struggled greatly with my name and what my name had done for me. And then when I was about 32 years old, I went to the beach one day and I found out that you could actually change your name. And I didn't know that I could change my name, but I found out that you can change your name and it costs about $800 to change your name. And you
Hmm.
just got to go to court, get the paperwork, and then the judge signs it and you give them
Yeah.
$800.
Yeah.
So I went to the beach one day and I had a discussion with God. I was like, the Bible tells me that you knew me from the foundations of time. You called me by name. So you knew way back, even before I was even born, that my name was going to be Bambi. And so I went through all of these hurts and pains that I had experienced. I had ex-husbands that never would call me by name, would never introduce me by my name. And I told God at that time that I never found my name and the meaning of my name in a name book. And I was going to go to a bookstore. And if my name wasn't in a book inside of one of those name books, I was changing my name to Janet. So I got into the car and I went to the bookstore and I went to Barnes and Noble and I grabbed their name books off of the shelf. And I wrote my name on a piece of paper. The first book, my name wasn't on there, wasn't in there at all. And the second book, I opened it up and my name was there. And so I wrote,
Okay.
as I had my name on a piece of paper, Bambi Lynn, God had my name in that book and the meaning of what my name meant. And
Mm.
so the world has a way of telling you who you are. And then God has a way of telling you who you are. And when he named me from the foundation to time, he named me Holy Child.
Mm.
My name means Holy Child. It doesn't mean
Okay.
exotic. It doesn't mean deer. It doesn't mean
Right.
dirty, but it meant Holy Child. And so when I walked out of that bookstore that day, I had a new identity. I didn't have to live up to the identity that the world gave to me. I got to live up to the identity that God gave to me. So I think that was a time that really took me on that journey, took me even more realizing that I needed some healing. I needed some time to really understand the depth of the pain that I was carrying because of the things that I went through in my life. I think that the name Bambi, finding out who I was the starting point. And then realizing that the trauma that I went through from being sexually assaulted to being, beat by a belt to being thrown across rooms, I had to realize that had nothing to do with me. It had to do with them. And that was a hard realization because I think that victims of trauma, we carry so much of the guilt. There was a time that my brother is 21 months younger than me. And we lived,
Okay.
so I was like 5 years old and he was in the garden. I don't know why he was in the garden, but I was in kindergarten and my dad loved my brother. My brother was the cream of the crop. This is 50 years ago, kind of thing, that when a dad had a son, he was macho. Well, my brother was allergic to everything under the sun, and he was in the garden and he started eating some beans. As a 5-year-old little girl, I didn't know what being allergic to anything meant. I thought, oh my goodness, my
Mm.
brother is eating beans and now my brother's going to die. And so I remember telling him that he was going to die. Well, that evening, my dad, we were in bed and my parents were downstairs. My brother starts crying and starts screaming, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. And he
Oh,
was brought downstairs, and my dad said, who told you that? Who would tell you that you're going to die? And out of his innocence, he said, well, Bambi did. Bambi told me I ate a bean and I'm going to die. And I remember my dad called me downstairs and he was angry and he yelled my name, Bambi, Lynn. And I walked downstairs and my dad stood up and he was removing his belt, from his pants. And I can still hear the sound of the belt being removed off of his pants. And my dad beat me until I couldn't walk. And he told me, don't you ever, ever say anything to my son again.
wow.
And I look back to that moment and I look back and now I can see that story and I can see the whole trauma of that and what it did to me. But now I can also see the life that my dad had. I
Hmm.
now can see where my dad came from. I can now see, instead of just saying, why would he do this to me? I now ask the questions, what happened to him? And
Hmm.
so when you look at other people in your life and how people treat you, instead of saying, why do they do that? You begin to start asking the questions, what brought them to that point? And that's
Yeah.
healing. That's letting go and saying that had nothing to do with you, but it had everything to do with their story too.
Yeah. And that's a process in itself.
Yes.
It's like I saw my grandfather around my dad and my uncles and realized that he treated them, other than the hitting part, he treated them the way that my dad treated me. And it was like, you can only do what you know. And that's what he knew. That was
Yes.
normal for him. And so before I get to asking about like how did you disrupt that, I want to ask you, because I believe this has to be a part of the process. How did you come to a point of forgiving him?
It's I read a book. I read a book titled The Shack. Did you ever
The
read
shack.
that book?
I haven't heard that.
It
Uh-uh.
is a story of a father that he had gone on a camping trip and there was a serial killer that grabbed his daughter and he went home without his daughter. And it talks about, and his wife had a relationship with Jesus and she called him Papa. And her relationship still continued even after her daughter was murdered and after her daughter was attacked by a serial killer. But there was a day in the book that the guy goes to his mailbox, and in the mailbox there was a letter, and the letter said, "Come to the cabin, love your papa." And so it became an allegory, and it became it actually was a book and a movie. And he went to the cabin. And what happened is that he met all three Godheads. He met all three, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, and they all took him on a journey. And when he met God, God happened to be like this Aunt Jemima black woman. And because he had to learn love that he didn't experience from his father. So the whole premises of the book is for us to have a huge world view that God is omnipresent, that he knows everything from the beginning to the end, and understanding how he sees everything. Sometimes we have tunnel vision. And until I read this book and until I watched the movie and until I wept over this whole thing and seeing it in action of this man having to forgive his father for what his father had done to him, and now he has to forgive what everybody else does to him.
Yeah.
It was the most amazing book and revelation in my life to not hold on to the things that my dad did, because my dad was only reacting under the things that he had gone through. And
Yeah.
we have to remember too, years ago, people didn't talk like this. You didn't talk about your feelings. You didn't talk about the pain. There was no healing, so to speak, like there is today. They lived what they were taught. And when I realized that, I began to start having compassion for my dad. And I began asking questions about what my dad went through. And my grandfather was a mean SOB. I remember walking into my grandparents' house one time, and my grandfather was sitting in the corner, and he had a beer, he had a Budweiser or a Miller or something sitting on his table, and he was leant over, and my grandmother was making some soup, and she had this huge black eye that nobody talked about.
Mm.
Nobody talked about it. We all know how she got that black eye, but you didn't dare talk about it. We now live in a society today that we can take our childhoods and we can start talking about it. And I think that becomes healing. But when I watched that movie and I read that book, and I've read that book at least 10 times, I
Wow.
got a realization that this isn't about whose fault things are. It's not about who did this, who did that. It's about looking at things from a bigger picture and having some grace for my dad.
Yeah. And it doesn't so much let them off
No,
for what they did. It just says, I understand it. And then I think probably your next step is then how do I not replicate that behavior
absolutely.
with my
And
own kids, which is then where I went about, well, how do I not continue this pattern of behavior
absolutely.
so that I can break it at this point and not have it replicated in my kids when they have
And the
kids?
funny thing is that yes, we do that and we don't want to replicate, and you have to walk in forgiveness not to replicate and not to put yourself as an idol in their lives thinking, "Oh, I can be better. I can do this." You know what? I
Yeah,
made different mistakes. And some of the
right.
different mistakes that I made also hurt my children. I didn't make the same mistakes that my
Mhm.
parents did.
Yeah,
I didn't beat them and I didn't, belittle them. And I made sure that I called them their first and middle name all the time. So I never wanted their name to ever feel like they were, because when we were kids, if I was called Bambi Lynn, you knew you were in trouble. So I always made it that I called them
yeah,
by their whole name because I wanted them.
yeah. When your whole name was used, it was like,
You knew
and
you
your
were in trouble.
your formal name. So I go by Bill, but when I would hear my William, I'd be like, oh great,
You're in trouble. So
I'm done now.
we didn't make the same some of us didn't make the same mistakes that our parents made, but we
Yeah,
made different mistakes. And we have to be humble enough, to be okay with the mistakes that we made, with our
yeah,
children. I have to be okay with my children coming to me and saying, "You may have not have done this, but you sure did this." Like I had my sons tell me, "Mom, my mother did not care. My mother, she never hugged me. My mother never told me she loved me. There was never any like excitement. Nothing
yeah,
was like awesome in our lives." So I decided to be a different mom. I decided I was going to make everything that when my children walked into a room, they were going to know that they were the shining star of that room. And so, and everything was about, making sure that when they left, they knew that they were loved. Well, and that was
hmm
my intention. My children
yeah.
tell me we felt like we were on a performance all the time.
Interesting.
And you're like, what? I just wanted you to feel awesome. I didn't want you to ever feel like I've ever felt like I was when I went into a room that nobody noticed me and then I was invisible to them. I wanted people to walk through the room and knew that you guys were the cream of the crop, the pride of my life. And they looked at it differently.
Well, and that's that whole perception thing where you're viewing it as I'm just showing you how much I love and care about you. and they're looking at it as, you're putting so much attention on me that I think I have to perform in a certain way
Absolutely.
to whatever, get approval or be accepted or
Yep.
be loved. and
So I may not have
and I
hit
think,
them and I may not have treated them the way that my mother did,
yeah,
but I got the same, some, in some aspect, I got the same thing that, and
yeah,
you're thinking you're doing something. So parenting, this generation is going to do it totally different than what we did, and then their generation. And it's a cycle. It's falling out of the plane and falling on your ass over and over again. That's pretty much what life
yeah.
is.
And I think it's being able to recognize your role in any situation, and not be the victim, and just say, so here's the role that I played. Because I think one of the things you brought up is, I think, how do we normalize these conversations? In some families, they're more normal than in others,
Mhm.
and some families, even today, it's like, no, we don't talk about that.
Yeah.
That's done. It's over. And so this idea of healing, and being vulnerable, I think there's a balance to it in terms of how do we approach it in a way that doesn't keep revisiting the trauma and moves us out of being a victim to being able to say, this is was my role in it.
Yes.
And even in the stuff I went through with my dad, I still played a role. And I didn't really invite that type of behavior. I didn't say, yeah, hit me again, or call me a little whatever again. And yet that role that I played enabled me to be the person I am today. And so I there was there was a lot of learning, I think, that went on there. And so
Absolutely.
so your process, how would you describe your process of personal growth?
I would say, we always talk about the elephant in the room. The things that I had gone through in my life were those elephants in the room. My grandfather was the
Mhm.
elephant in the room. My dad was the elephant in the room. My ex-husbands were the elephant in the room. My uncle that abused me was an elephant in the room. The men that took advantage of me were always the elephant in the room. We're always the elephant that I can talk about to keep myself a victim.
Right.
Because here we are and there comes a point in your life that you're sick and tired of being sick and tired of being the victim in the room. And so you begin to start dealing with that elephant in the room so that elephant can leave. But once that elephant leaves out of the room, your elephant returns. And that
Hmm.
elephant is yours. That elephant is, I did not deserve what had happened to me. I did not
Yeah.
deserve the things that people did to me. But the condition of my heart also brought on some of those things that did happen to me. And
Yeah.
now I have to deal with my elephant in the room. I'm no longer the victim anymore. I'm no longer the person anymore that can tell my story and have everybody feel sorry for me. I now
Right.
am the person that is digging myself out of the pit of despair and digging myself out of the turmoil of life and saying, I don't want to be that person anymore. Because it gets to a point when you first tell your story, it gives you a high because everybody's around listening to you and they're patting you on the back and they're going, ah, ah, ah. But the longer you keep telling your story, for me personally, the more that I
Yeah.
kept telling my story, I started getting yucky. Like, I don't want to tell this anymore. And I think that that's also why it took me so long to write my book. I didn't want to be the unforgiving person anymore. I didn't want to be the callous person anymore to look at their lives and say what they did to me. I wanted to make sure that when I wrote my book, I wrote it out of a pure heart just to tell my story. I didn't want that icky feeling anymore that people that looked at me and said, oh, she's the girl that got molested when she was a little girl. Oh, she's the girl. She's the woman that her husband beats her. I didn't want to be that woman
Mhm.
anymore. And I think that that was the beginning point of healing for my own selves is that I just didn't want to be that anymore. I wanted to be somebody that has this trauma and has this story and has these scars, that brought me to the door, but I wanted to be that person that left all that trauma at the door and brought the lessons on the platform and
Yeah.
brought what I healed from and what I learned from it. I didn't want the trauma anymore. And that's why when I talk about my trauma, I don't go into great details anymore because it's not who I am anymore. I am somebody that wants to find these women and I want to hug them and I want to tell them that they don't need to stay in their victim mentality anymore. I want to be that woman that wraps a superhero cape around them and say, you know what you went through has given you the ability to tell your story and to set other people free. You are a superhero. I want to be that person that puts a crown on women's head and says you are the daughter of the king. Let's go out and take the lessons and the scars and the pain that you have gone through and let's go out and share it so somebody else can share it again. I had been
Yeah.
burned as at when I was 25 years old. I had a pressure canner blow up on me, and a pressure canner is a canning device that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we
Yeah.
weren't
It's under
using it.
pressure. And,
Yep, we weren't using
yep.
it as canning. I was making spaghetti sauce. I had put up 500 quarts of food every year, for my children, and there was a pressure canner that blew up on me
Yep.
and blew up on my ex-husband, and we had to spend time in the burn unit for 17 days. I was in a burn unit, and every day they would take me into a room. They would tie my hands. They would shoot me up with morphine and they would start scrubbing off the residue of
Hmm.
of the burn, and so the new skin can grow. That's what healing is. It's that you
Hmm.
have to be willing to lay on that metal bar, on that metal bed, and you have to be willing to be scrubbed until the new skin can be formed again. And that's not easy. That's
Yeah.
and
And
sometimes what
it
happens.
takes time.
Yeah, and what happened is that I was scrubbed for 5 days and they couldn't. It was so painful to me that they finally grafted me. They finally took new skin and put it on
Yeah.
me so I didn't have to go through that scrubbing anymore, but they gave me
Yeah.
the new skin and they took off as much. And that's what our lives are about. Our lives are about getting rid of the trauma, getting rid of the effect of the trauma and not having it affect us so much. And the more that you tell your story, the less it affects you anymore. And that's how you know that you've been healed from it.
Yeah. So great. Love how you relate all your stories to some metaphor of growing or processing or working through something, because it is true. The experiences that we have can inform the lives that we lead. And so as we start to wind down, I have just one more question in terms of how do you want to use your influence? Because you said you want to influence, especially women, to grow and to become. I mean, you didn't say this, but what I'm hearing you say is you want to support them to become their most authentic selves.
Absolutely.
And so what do you do, or how do you want to use that influence that you have in the stories to be able to do that today in the world that we live in?
That's why I wrote my story. That's why I wrote my books, and that's why I continue to write. I have a third book coming out, The God Who Sees, which is stories of 29 different women in the Bible that have been through some
Hmm.
of the stuff that we have been through. And as
Okay.
women, there is some stuff that God has given us these opportunities within the Bible to show us that He never left us, He never forsook us, He never left us alone. And I want to be that woman that tells my story enough that other women, will be able to tell theirs. I do sell it, like I sell a t-shirt that says my story, your first aid kit, as a conversational piece of knowing that every story becomes somebody else's first aid kit. Every time
Yeah.
that you plow a story, plow your life and tell your story, you're plowing the field for somebody else to be able to do that. You're dropping the seeds for them to be able to grow. So my heart's desire is to just, I want everybody to know that yes, life damages us. Yes, life hurts us. Yes, but that doesn't mean it's kind of like climbing up a mountain. You know, we always talk about the mountaintop experience, but we need to talk about the climbing of it. Climbing a
Hmm.
mountain is never easy. I climbed mountains in California, and they were not easy. I would fall and scratch my, my knees, and you're sweaty. You're like, I just want to quit. You didn't bring enough water, But then when you get to the
Yeah.
mountain, you're able to see the horizon. But what I want people to also do is not only see the horizon, but to look down the mountain and see how far they came, that they didn't
Nice.
give up, that's what
Yeah.
climbing is all about. It's not giving up because there is a horizon to see. It's, I want to be able to tell the story. I'm such a storyteller, and there is, when you hear the story of the oyster had no pearl inside of the oyster until the oyster went through something, until the oyster
Yeah.
was attacked by the parasites and the sand and the winds and the hurricanes. Then when you open up that oyster, you open it up and you see this pearl. And the amount of distress that oyster went through is how the size of that pearl is. I
Yeah.
want people to understand that, yes, we go through things in our lives. We struggle in our lives. But at the end of it, there are treasures along the way. And that there's treasures that we can pass down to generation to generation. And so my heart's desire is to be able to be as many platforms as I can possibly be on, to be as many podcasts that I can possibly be on, to be able to give hope to the hopeless, be able to
Right.
give, wholeness to the broken, to be able to tell them that your ashes are going to create something beautiful, because everything must die in order for there to be growth. So sometimes we have to die to
Mhm.
ourselves, we have to die to our stories, and we all have chapters. We all have chapters that we wish we didn't have. But that's what
Yeah.
creates this beautiful masterpiece that is being written for us.
Nice. Well, that is very beautiful approach to life and to sharing. And so, how do people find you?
Oh, well, you can find me. I'm on all kind of social medias. I am on Facebook, which is Bambi Lynn. I am on Instagram, which is Lynn.Bambi. I'm on LinkedIn. I am on TikTok now, and now, since I haven't banded it again, I'm there again. I also have my own
Okay.
website called healingthroughstories.com, where I give the opportunity that I blog each week. And I also give opportunities for women to be able to blog and tell their stories, or men if they want. And right now
Yeah.
on my podcast, on my blog, if you subscribe to my blog and you want to purchase my books or a t-shirt on there, there is a 10% code that is on my website that you can get your whole order 10% off, that I'm offering right now to, all the audiences that I'm, impacting.
Great. Well, this has been a really fun conversation, very informative and interesting, again, to hear your story and the things that you've gone through and the ways that you've worked through it. And for those who are listening, to give hope that no matter what your circumstances are, if you choose to do your own work, there's a way through it. And
Absolutely.
so I want to thank you for being my guest today, and have a really lovely rest of your day. And for all you listening, you've been listening to the Origination Point podcast. If this content is interesting for you, subscribe, share it, put it in your social media. And if you have questions or thoughts or anything you want to share in our community, you can go to our website, delacruzleadershipsolutions.com, and contact us and subscribe. And most importantly, keep growing.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.